Now that conflict has come, the only way to limit its duration is to apply decisive force. And I assure you, this will not be a campaign of half measures, and we will accept no outcome but victory.
As of 2023, 61% of Americans now oppose the invasion of Iraq, as the war moves into what seems to be a long-distant memory of a far different time. Initially, in the period succeeding 9/11 and preceding the Iraq War, Americans found intervention very favorable. Over time, however, the warmth of the general public towards the Bush administration's decisions have soured. There were multiple reasons listed by the United States government for the invasion of Iraq. First, the disarmament of Iraqi WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction. Two, an end to Saddam Hussein's support for terrorist organizations. Three, humanitarian concern for the Iraqi people and the intent to free them from Baathist oppression. Now, the American people look back on these justifications and feel deceived, as thousands of innocent Iraqis and American troops died in the process of this effort, and to boot, as it seems, there were supposedly no weapons of mass destruction discovered by the intervention. Finally, a terrorist state, Iran now controls Iraq as a client state, and the United States seems to have done nothing to aid in reconstruction. On the other hand, let us be completely clear before we dive into any of these topics. The Bush administration never claimed, contrary to popular opinion, that the Ba'athist dictatorship of Saddam Hussein had any hand in the events of 9/11. Rather, its gripe was that Iraq had become a central host to Islamist terror organizations in the Middle East. First and foremost, let's talk about life during the Saddam years. Under Saddam, the quality of life of the Iraqi people dramatically declined. Its per person income sharply fell from 1980 to 2002, from being more prosperous than Spain to in greater poverty than Angola. Public services were neglected, and the education system focused on completely indoctrinating the youth in the most vitriolic and eventually religious and divisive cancer. In 1998, all female secretaries were fired from their governmental positions, and women were barred from leaving Iraq without male escorts. In 2000, women were blocked legislatively from laboring outside of their homes. Political opponents and their relatives were kidnapped, tortured, and raped by the state. The Mukhabarat, a branch of the Iraqi intelligence service, would kidnap and rape the relatives of suspected opponents, record these assaults, and send them to suspects as blackmail. Often, female relatives of prisoners would be killed in front of them to coerce confessions. An interim report of the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Iraq recorded the following. General al-Salehi reported that on June 7th of 2000 he received a telephone call from Baghdad and was told to go and collect a gift from a store in Amman. This consisted of a videotape showing the rape of a female family member. 10 days later, he reportedly received a call from the Iraqi intelligence service. He was asked if he had received the gift and was told that one of his female family members was in the hands of Iraqi intelligence. He was then again urged to stop his activities. General al-Salehi, during an interview with the Special Rapporteur, stated that he was willing to surrender the videotape only at the trial of a top Iraqi government official. Saddam Hussein attempted to exterminate the Kurds through the Al-Anfal campaign, using the mobilization of mustard gas, sarin gas, and VX, all of which are WMDs. The death toll of this genocide could not have been less than 50,000 individuals, according to the Human Rights Watch. Non-Arabs were excluded from Iraqi society, and hundreds of thousands of Kurdish men, women, and children were displaced. Foreign news broadcasts, satellite dishes, modems, and fax machines were banned by the Ba'athist dictatorship as well for general public use. Iraq under Saddam attained more foreign debt per capita of GNP than any other nation on the planet. 124 billion USD was owed to other nations and foreign corporations. Throughout all of Iraq, there wasn't a single credit facility. Food rations needed to be imported. Productivity stagnated, and only 5,500,000 individuals had access to safe drinking water out of Iraq's population of 25 million people. The sewage systems were a disaster, and any electricity generation which Baghdad was able to attain was only due to confiscating and redistributing electrical power from the rest of Iraq, especially the rural regions, which were left with a maximum of 12 hours of electricity per day. There was no independent judiciary, there was no free or responsible press, there were no public services in many instances, and where they were generally left on the verge of collapse, and the Shia population was left with particularly underfunded health and educational infrastructure. Throughout his time in power, Saddam Hussein funded and backed countless acts of international terrorism. In 1993, the Iraqi intelligence service attempted to assassinate former President George H.W. Bush and the Emir of Kuwait. Saddam sheltered the Mujahideen-e-Khalq organization during its time as a terrorist organization before its political moderation, as well as the Palestine Liberation Front, known exclusively for sabotaging civilian aircraft, and which was responsible for killing an elderly disabled U.S. Jewish civilian named Leon Klinghoffer. Saddam sheltered the Abu Nidal organization, or the ANO, and its founder as well. In fact, Abu Nidal was so closely interlinked with the Ba'athist interests that the ANO would find its foundation beginning within Iraq itself. The ANO, over the course of its existence, killed and injured over 900 individuals across the span of 20 different nations. Saddam incentivized Palestinian suicide bombings by rewarding families of suicide bombers with up to 25,000 USD. A branch of the Iraqi intelligence services known as Directorate 14, which cooperated with the MEK, was being headquartered at the Salman Pak facility, which gave training to Palestinian, Syrian, Yemeni, Lebanese, Egyptian, and Sudanese operatives in carrying out espionage and assassinations, managing explosives, and attaining training in marksmanship. In short, if you'd like to stop here, you can. The case is clear cut. Saddam Hussein was a terrible dictator who gassed his people and emulated a form of terror and forced conformity that even Adolf Hitler could have only dreamed of. The individuals in power which Saddam Hussein enabled were completely monstrous, such as his own son, Uday Hussein, a murderer and a confirmed serial rapist. The Iraqi people lived horrible lives, and their nation was economically crippled by Saddam's own ineptitude. This was clearly a humanitarian crisis, and it was our moral duty as a power in the world stage to not simply stand by and watch. This much is indisputable. In response to the genocidal terror in the north against the Kurds and the Shiites in the south, no fly zones were first instituted in 1991 to prevent the Baathist dictatorship from flying within the zones of these ethnic groups and bringing them further harm. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, the weapons of mass destruction. First, let's cover the UN inspection process before the invasion of Iraq. In the years following the invasion of 2003, the question was posed, where were the weapons of mass destruction mentioned relentlessly by the Bush administration? The public, by now, as of 2025, seems to have found its answer, unanimously agreeing that there were no weapons of mass destruction. The primary justification in invading Iraq was the presumption that they had weapons of mass destruction in violation of Security Council Resolution 687. On April 6th of 1991, Iraq officially accepted its position, bearing the resolution, and began relinquishing its WMDs, so it seemed. In June, the UNSCOM, or United Nations Special Commission, began its first chemical weapons inspection. Iraq declared 127,941 special munitions to the inspectors. The fate of thousands of unfilled Iraqi special munitions was completely undisclosed to them, while hundreds upon hundreds of filled special munitions were entirely unaccounted for by the inspectors as well. Was suspicion not already merited right off the bat? 3 tons of bacterial growth material for biological weapons, 40 kilograms of casein, enough for the formulation of 1,200 liters of concentrated botulinum toxin, 80 kilograms of thioglycolate, a bare minimum of 520 kilograms of yeast extract, sufficient at the lowest estimates as they stand to produce 26,000 liters of Bacillus anthracis spores, and 1,100 kilograms of peptone, enough to create 5,500 liters of concentrated perfringens agents. All of these things were left completely unaccounted for in the inspections by the United Nations. Given appropriate storage conditions, according to the UN, the yeast extract in peptone, the most dangerous items, could have been usable by at least 1999. We still do not know what happened to almost all of this unaccounted for material. All Iraqi biological weapons were declared as destroyed by their own accounts by July of 1991. However, they remained as late as 1999. No certainty regarding the quantity of WMDs destroyed or the conditions or locations under which such destruction of WMDs took place. For example, the Iraqi government's recollection of the destruction of the Al Hussein warheads, which contained chemical weapons, changed with almost every new inspection team, and there was never a single scrap of evidence provided to confirm Iraq's claim of the complete destruction of these warheads. A letter dated January 27th of 1999 from the permanent representatives of the Netherlands and Slovenia to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, stated, on weapons, the team concluded that the material balances and their subcomponents declared in the FFCD for biological bombs and Al Hussein warheads could not be verified. Furthermore, the account in the FFCD on biological spray devices, modified drop tanks, and the aerosol generator could not be verified. The material balances for bulk biological weapons agents and their subcomponents for all declared agents could not be verified. The media material balance and its subcomponents could not be verified. At every step, the Iraqi government continued to sabotage the inspections of the UNSCOM inspectors at Iraqi sites. By March of 1995, Iraq provided the United Nations with a second FFCD, or full, final, and complete disclosure, as it's called, of its illegal weapons programs, which were banned in 1991. By July, however, Iraq admitted for the first time, after evidence discovered by UNSCOM, that they had indeed been running an offensive biological weapons program, while denying the weaponization of this weapons program. In August, Saddam Hussein's son in law, Hussein Kamel, the former director of Iraq's Military Industrialization Corporation, defected from the dictatorship, forcing Iraq to provide its third, final FFCD, as it admitted to having created more than 30,000 liters of anthrax and other agents for biological weaponry previously completely unknown and unaccounted for by inspectors. Soon, Iraq withdrew the FFCD, subsequently admitting to having weaponized its biological weapons program after previously denying this and lying to UNSCOM, also admitting having achieved great progress previously unknown to the UN in developing its long range missile program. By October of 1997, UNSCOM finished destroying large sums of equipment used in the creation of chemical weapons, which Iraq had previously denied using for that purpose until a few months prior in May, when Iraq finally admitted that some of the destroyed equipment had indeed been used in the production of VX. Going into January of 1998, Iraq was still notably obstructing the attempts at inspections. By October of 1998, Iraq completely ceased cooperating with UNSCOM in their inspections, and Security Council Resolution 1205 was passed, which unanimously condemned Iraq's noncompliance with the inspection process. The fact is that Iraq was not genuinely inspected in any meaningful way. UNSCOM expressed in its records that the Baathist dictatorship built dummy facilities to deceive inspectors, bulldozed military sites, refused to allow inspectors to interview scientists, and concealed accumulations of chemical and biological components. Iraq's possible disposal of WMDs without UN oversight would also be a violation of the UN resolutions, anyways. Yunmovich, the successor to UNSCOM, was unable to verify Iraq's claim to have destroyed roughly 50 Scud-type warheads, which were intended to be used as chemical or biological weapons, and a 50-ton trailer initially imported for Iraqi use as a mobile missile launcher. Baghdad failed to remain consistent in recounting the number of special warheads it had to Yunmovich, and while the Iraqis claimed to have only manufactured 50 chemical and 25 biological warheads, UNSCOM had previously fallen under the apprehension that well over 100 special warheads had been produced, while it only verified the destruction of roughly three-quarters of those special warheads. At this point, it should have been impossible to have believed that Iraq completely abandoned its nuclear pursuits after all of this lying. Iraq consistently weakened inspection abilities and resources through hiding information and equipment between 1991 and 1998, and doing so at the cost, mind you, of a great loss in income from potential exports, which were otherwise hindered at this point by the international sanctions which had cracked down on the Iraqi economy during this period, as Iraq refused to comply with UNSCOM. Abd al-Tawwab Mullah Khuwayash recalled that Saddam Hussein had sometime in 1999 taken an interest in what was essentially an implication to restart Iraq's chemical agent production. Khuwayash reported that within 6 months he could begin to produce mustard gas for Saddam Hussein, while VX and sarin would of course take much longer to manufacture. In 2001, Saddam approached Khuwayash again, inquiring, "Do you have any programs going on that I don't know about?" It couldn't be clearer that Saddam had interests in restarting his WMD program, but later evidence will show that it's hard to believe that he hadn't already resumed sarin production at this point. By early 2002, Qusay Hussein, the son of Saddam Hussein, asked Abd al-Tawwab Mullah Khuwayash to jot down a list of Iraqi biological weapons experts, supposedly to supply Bashar al-Assad, a claim which didn't make much sense since Assad was an enemy of the Baathist dictatorship in Iraq. Let's talk about the Iraq War now, the main event in this discussion. Scott Ritter, an Iraqi sympathizer and a member of the UN inspections, although largely discredited due to being a horrifying person now, pointed out something very important which would later come back to shoot him in the foot. Sarin has a shelf life of no more than 5 years. By even 2002, even if Iraq had maintained old sarin gas from 1991 under proper storing conditions, the sarin gas from a disbanded weapons program should have been nothing but harmless goo, as he put it, and therefore, if Iraq did stop sarin production in 1991, it would no longer be volatile by 1996. It should be noted that sarin does not last past a few weeks on its own without proper conditions. Keep the previously iterated facts in mind. Keep in mind as well that Iraqi insurgents couldn't have possibly created VX or sarin gas, which they did in fact use, as in one instance of 41 Soccer 18 rockets, which were recovered by Polish forces from Iraqi insurgents, and which they could have only come into contact with if they were given it by Saddam Hussein's regime and its leftovers. Surely, the munitions utilized did date back to a pre Gulf War time, as the UN addendum states. However, these munitions were not kept in appropriate storage and were extremely degraded when recovered. If Ritter's statement regarding sarin is true, then the rulings of the addendum which stated that the residual sarin was not provided by the Baathist regime to insurgents cannot be correct, and the sarin within the munitions could not have been that old at all, regardless of the fact that the munitions used by insurgents was. This is due in large part to the fact that sarin needs to be stored in appropriate conditions to be able to last its full lifetime, and these munitions simply were not. Furthermore, some may object that Syria may have provided the Iraqi insurgents with sarin. This is, however, extraordinarily unlikely, as it was the regime loyalist organizations such as Fatah and Saddam which were using sarin, organizations which Bashar al Assad loathed, not Iraqi insurgents which Syria was sympathetic to. So, where did the sarin come from? There are two options. One, there was an Iraqi sarin production facility which Baathist troops destroyed during the Iraq War. Two, a sarin production facility had been given to the Baathist insurgency, which was eventually destroyed as well. Sarin couldn't have otherwise been used. We shouldn't be too disheartened by the fact that mobile WMD production facilities, which had been reported by eyewitnesses, were never found, as the Iraqis, as demonstrated through UN inspections, seemed to have a hard enough time keeping track of their own materials as it was. The assertion that the Iraqis would destroy evidence of WMDs is frequently scoffed at. After all, it seems awfully convenient to spectators that once the United States invaded, the evidence for WMDs just up and vanished. A statement by David Kay on the Interim Progress Report on the activities of the Iraq Survey Group states the following. In addition to the discovery of extensive concealment efforts, we have been faced with a systematic sanitization of documentary and computer evidence in a wide range of offices, laboratories, and companies suspected of WMD work. The pattern of these efforts to erase evidence, hard drives destroyed, specific files burned, equipment cleaned of all traces of use, are ones of deliberate rather than random acts. For example, all IIS laboratories visited by IIS exploitation teams have been clearly sanitized, including the removal of much equipment, shredding and burning of documents, and even the removal of nameplates from office doors. David Kay did quickly retract his stance on the Iraq War, believing that there were heavy intelligence errors that occurred. However, this very video is intended to challenge that assertion, so bear with me. The sanitization clearly did happen. The evidence of sanitization done by the regime remains as clear as day. Furthermore, plenty of regimes have done this scrubbing in the past. The Third Reich, for example, I don't mean to overuse the Hitler comparisons, but they burned their documents, and further evidence of crimes as the Allied powers marched through Germany. They even destroyed much evidence of Holocaust related crimes. The question then stands, if Saddam had WMDs still as late as 2003, why did Saddam not utilize them himself against the US invasion? Simple. Saddam personally expressed that he feared retaliation by America if he deployed chemical weapons on them as early as 1991 during the Gulf War. He had been told that the deployment of WMDs on American troops would be disastrous for Iraq. On top of this, the deployment of the WMDs, which Saddam had access to, would have easily been counteracted by American troops, who do have easy access anti-WMD military technology. Insurgents using sarin doesn't show a deliberate attempt by the Iraqi army to use WMDs on American troops, but rather a breakdown in military command and control. Iraq expressly did not want to use chemical weapons on US troops ever since the Gulf War in 1991. Iraq's WMD program was for Iran, not the United States. On the other hand, The usage of WMDs by insurgents does show that they did know of where sarin gas had been stored by the Iraqi military, which allowed them to deploy it. On May 17th of 2004, a 155 millimeter artillery round filled with 43% pure sarin gas exploded near American troops, the first of many instances of sarin gas usage in Iraqi bombs, as between 2005 to 2006, a shocking discovery would be made. Through Operation Avarice, 400 Borak rockets were bought from Secret Dealer, a rocket model which was manufactured in Iraq during the late 1980s, which was now internationally banned, which had previously been accounted for by the UN. The purity level of the sarin within these Borak rockets reached an average of 13%, while some sarin weapons recovered in 2006 had a purity level of 25%, meaning they had to have been made in any case well after 1999. In instances other than sarin, 5,000 chemical weapons previously unaccounted for by the UN in their inspections was discovered in Iraq and for a time covered up by the US government as they were attempting to find an active WMD program after 9/11. What this discovery of chemical weapons means is that even if Iraq hadn't had an active WMD program, they very much intended to retain their weapons arsenal to restart production as soon as the world was no longer looking. Other than in 2004 during Polish and American encounters with sarin gas being used within older shells, not many more direct contacts between American troops and sarin gas were made, or so it seems. In 2013, it became known through a report that many new vets from the Iraq War at the time were suffering from a disease known as the Gulf War Syndrome, known to be caused in many cases now from nothing other than exposure to sarin gas. After the fall of Baghdad, the backyard garden of Iraqi nuclear scientist Mahdi Obeidi was uncovered. 12 years prior, under orders from Qusay Hussein and Hussein Kamel, Obeidi had buried the components of a nuclear centrifuge in his backyard, with the order to be ready to begin construction of a nuclear bomb again in the future. Obeidi handed over the buried documents and centrifuge components to U.S. officials after leading them to it. Clearly, not only had Iraq not given up its nuclear ambitions, but given another few years, they very well may have fulfilled them. Now let's turn our attention to the reconstruction of facilities preceding the Iraq War. The foot and mouth disease vaccine facility in Al Dawra, one of at least two biocontainment level 3 facilities in Iraq, which it admitted to the UN had been utilized as a biological weapons facility, had initially been closed down. By 2001, however, Iraq announced its reopening as a simple vaccine facility without UN approval. UN inspectors from UNMOVIC inspected the facility and discovered that it still retained capabilities for a dual use function. On top of this, some of the facility's equipment had been notably relocated to a secondary facility, which the UN had no follow up on. A report titled UN Weapons Inspectors Probe Sites Related to Germ Warfare and Nuclear Arms states during the inspection, the team learned that some equipment had been transferred to another facility, spokesman Hiro Yuaki told reporters in Baghdad. This was immediately followed by activities at a small veterinary medicine facility about 20 kilometers north of Baghdad. The U.S. reported in its authorization for use of military force against Iraq resolution of 2002 that Iraq was seeking to purchase chemical weapons, agents, precursors, and applicable production equipment, and was making an effort to hide activities at the Fallujah plant, which was one of Iraq's chemical weapons production facilities before the Gulf War. When the United States invaded, thousands of Ba'ath insurgents flocked to Fallujah when reasonably they should have been at Baghdad while it was under siege, but they weren't. Defending the palace at Baghdad would have been the only reasonable option, unless the insurgents were hiding something, as they heavily resisted the arrival of US forces. The insurgents defended Fallujah for 8 months before their defeat, during which time the 1920 Revolution Brigades and Ansar al-Sunnah appeared in Fallujah as well to defend the location alongside al-Qaeda, the Islamic Army, and the Ba'ath Party. If there was nothing of extreme value worth defending and ensuring Americans couldn't have gotten their hands on over the course of the 8 months Fallujah was barricaded, why did the Iraqi army position the Major General Mohammed Latif in charge of the city? And why was the Chief of Staff of the Republican Guard, Jassim Mohammed Saleh, put in charge of the city prior to Latif's leadership? This is why. As of February of 2003, at the Fallujah chlorine plant and three other plants, Iraq amassed multiple times more chlorine production, 22 tons per day, than needed for civilian water treatment, demonstrated by the fact that chlorine, which can be used in the creation of mustard gas and nerve agents, was being heavily diverted for military purposes. Nkat Rajan, the project manager of NEC Private Engineers Ltd., which built the Fallujah plant, confirmed that it was intended during its construction to be controlled by the Ministry of Military Industries of Iraq, according to the ministry's own reports to Rajan, a strange department to be in charge of the ownership of a chlorine plant, to be sure. On top of this, NEC provided Iraq with titanium vessels, spherical aluminum powder, titanium centrifugal pumps, and industrial cells with platinum anodes, which it was investigated for having sold to Iraq illegally. Yet another nail in the coffin for the conclusion that Iraq had indeed restarted, at least on some notable scale, or was preparing to restart, the production of chemical weapons. By September of 2002, the Iraqis had also rebuilt structures which had been dismantled by UNSCOM at their Al Mamoun facility, structures originally designed for the construction of solid propellant motors for their now illegal Badr 2000 missile program. NEC also had ties to the facility through its production of ammonium tetrachlorate meant for these solid propellant motors. The former Al Farad gas centrifuge manufacturing facility, bombed in 1998 by the Clinton administration, was also being rebuilt by October of 2002, with no intentions publicly disclosed by the Iraqi government for the reconstruction. However, one doesn't need to ponder for too long on what might have been planned behind the reconstruction of a gas centrifuge manufacturing facility. In short, Saddam did have weapons of mass destruction, and nobody should allow themselves to be told that he did not. His nuclear program was defunct for the time, but it certainly would not have been for long. As the evidence shows from what we found buried in Obeidi's backyard, it was our duty, as a world power, to ensure that the despotic Baathist dictatorship in Iraq did not have even more time than it did in its period of international noncompliance to recalibrate its chemical and biological weapons program on a large scale, and to ensure that it did not succeed in reestablishing its nuclear program, not only for the sake of the Kurds and the Shia community, but for the world as well. Was it all worth it in the end? This may boil down to a point of personal concern. Was it our responsibility to help rebuild Iraq? Yes. Did we? To some extent. Should we have done more? Yes, and it is a national shame that we didn't. Instead, the United States shrunk away and failed to adequately aid a nation which needed its help. Does this detract from the justification of the invasion? No, not at all. It is undeniable that the intervention, even if there were no weapons of mass destruction, was absolutely worthwhile for the Kurds and the Shias, if not for a vast bulk of the general Iraqi population. Some may object, however, was the cost of life worth it? George Galloway protested with this in mind. His protest is an error, however. Although civilian casualties in any war should never be underemphasized, the fact is that not 1 million, as Lancet put it, but 122,000 recorded deaths during the Iraq War happened to be from civilians. At least 11,000 of these deaths were due to anti occupation forces and Iraqi insurgents, while about 44,000 of these deaths were due to post invasion criminal activity, with the rest attributable to either unknown or coalition led forces. This information was compiled by the Iraqi body count, opposed to the popular Lancet death count, which recorded 601 violent deaths, a flagrantly invalid number. The Lancet report was discredited by not only the US administration, but by Iraqi officials as well. Were the horrors worth the outcome? One has to say so. By February of 2006, 2.43 billion USD in funds had been given to the Iraqi people in food, water, and medicine. 10.5 billion had been put towards the Iraqi economy, national security, and political spheres. Free democratic elections had arrived, and between 2002 and 2005, the GDP grew from 18.9 billion USD to 33.1 billion USD. A new stable currency allowed Iraq's central bank to slash inflation down to negative 6.3% by October of 2009. Iraq has now had the vast bulk of its debt forgiven from the Saddam era. 43.7 million Iraqis as of 2022 had access to cell services after having only a few dozen thousand with access in 2003, indicating a massive explosion in consumer power. By February of 2006, we, the United States, had constructed and reconstructed water treatment plants for 2,700,000 Iraqis and sewage plants for 4,900,000. There were far more benefits that I can't really mention in the allotted time, provided in the areas of agriculture, immunization, etc. Today, Iraq is on the track to ending its water crisis. As the UN has noted in stating, Iraq is not only accelerating progress towards clean water and sanitation, but also strengthening climate action, protecting biodiversity, and fostering a more resilient and equitable future for all. Beyond these benefits for future generations, the world as a whole became safer when Saddam was deposed from power. The world no longer needs to worry about the curation of a nuclear program. in the hands of the Ba'ath Party or any other WMDs, as the Ba'athist Party in Iraq will never return to power. Today, over 74% of Iraqis finally feel safe walking alone at night. There's been a 12% decline in the percent of Iraqis perceiving themselves as in suffering since at least 2008, and the amount of well-being experienced overall by Iraqis has increased by over 10%, according to self-reports, since then. One cannot imagine that Iraq would be seeing this progress today, albeit incremental and slow, if the Ba'athist dictatorship was still in power. Although the present situation is not ideal, and Iran presently controls Iraqi politics in large part, hope remains for the future.